Welcome to You Decide. I'm your host, Errol Lewis. Late last week, Mayor Mamdani announced the appointment of a nationally recognized tenant organizer. She's new to a lot of people. She's not new to this podcast. This is her third appearance. Cea Weaver has been named director of the newly revitalized Mayor's Office to Protect Tenants. But before that, she was the executive director of Housing Justice for All and also the New York State Tenant Bloc. Those are sibling organizations that work to strengthen tenant organizing and push for pro-tenant legislation. She has been involved in this field for quite a long time. She was a policy advisor to the Zohran Mamdani mayoral campaign and is a frequent spokesperson and has terrorized her opponents in Albany for a number of years now. She joins us to talk about her new role, what the office is going to do, and what the housing prospects are going to look like in New York, where we do, in fact, have a housing emergency. So welcome and congratulations.
Thank you so much. I am happy to be here.
Tell us about the Mayor's Office to Protect Tenants. What does that office do? And I'm struck by the fact that it even exists, because tenants are sort of a supermajority of New Yorkers. Why do they need a special office?
Well, I think that the reality is that for a very long time, our housing policy doesn't always put renters at the front and center of the initiatives. And so we are signaling with this office our intention to make sure that pro-tenant policy is weaved into every aspect of the administration's housing agenda. It's important to do that even in a city that is majority renter, because for so long there has been overwhelming emphasis placed on property as the primary form of housing policy. And so we really need to make sure that you can have stability, you can have dignity, you can have affordability, even if you rent.
The Mayor's Office to Protect Tenants was created in 2019 under Mayor Bill de Blasio. He did it by executive order. Do you expect to focus on all tenants, or is this primarily about the rent-stabilized ones?
I think that we want to make sure that anyone who rents their home in New York has the stability that they need to live a safe, stable, and affordable life. That's really the goal here. And we got started with two big initiatives that I'm excited to tell you about in a little bit. Today, I'm sure we will touch on them.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. Well, tell me about them.
Yeah. So the first thing that we did is we decided to intervene in a bankruptcy proceeding with a landlord called Pinnacle Realty Group. They're one of the biggest landlords in the city. And the buildings are primarily rent stabilized. The landlord has not been making repairs. The buildings are in deep disrepair and facing bankruptcy and foreclosure. And so we decided to intervene in the court proceedings to protect the tenants' living conditions and also the rent stabilization status and the affordability of the buildings. The second thing that we rolled out in just our first week, it's been less than a week, is a series of hearings across the 5 boroughs where we are going to tackle the sort of non-rent fees that make rents affordable. One that I've heard a lot about in the last few days, even since we announced this initiative, is a credit card processing fee that many landlords are transitioning to online payment portals to pay your rent, and that's very convenient.
Yes.
But it can add a 2.5% fee every time you pay your rent. That's a 2.5% rent increase for the tenant. So tackling both like the sort of non-rent fees, the living conditions, and the precarity that a renter faces when their building changes hands is some of the things that we are hoping to be able to do.
I don't know what you're going to find on the credit card side of things, but that sounds like a pass-along fee. I mean, that's what the processors are charging the landlords, right?
Yeah, they're charging, it's being passed on to the renters, yeah. And, I think one of the things that we're really looking at and exploring is, we're doing that initiative with the department, DWCP, the Department of Workers and Consumer Protections. Tenants are consumers of a product in our city. And so treating them that way, in a way, is one of the things that we're hoping to be able to do.
The Pinnacle Group, my understanding is that they borrowed about $1 billion to buy up a little over 5,000 units of rent-stabilized housing. And over the years, meaning over the last decade or so, it all kind of went south. They blamed it. I looked through some of the real estate reporting on it. They blamed it on interest rates that shot up in a way that they didn't anticipate, as well as the ongoing problem of trying to, sort of squeeze a level of rents out that the law does not allow them to charge. Is that pretty much what happened?
I think that the Pinnacle buildings are over 100 years old in some cases. They are in need of capital improvement, and Pinnacle in order to sort of sustain the debt that they took on, has been deferring repairs, pursuing evictions, and deferring maintenance. And so now the buildings are in quite bad shape. And so our goal is to ensure that whoever takes on these properties, because they are on the process of changing hands, is going to prioritize making repairs in those buildings and, complying with our rent stabilization laws, which are the laws of New York.
I can't pretend to know all of the ins and outs of the numbers, but at least one account that I read suggested that a change in the rent stabilization laws, one that you probably helped bring about in 2019, contributed to their eventual business failure and bankruptcy.
Well, the reality is that in the run-up to 2019, tenants were facing tremendous pressure to move out of their apartment, and the rent laws prior to 2019 are a huge driver of a loss of affordability in our city, and a driver of rents that are going up everywhere. The laws in 2019 corrected. They didn't. They really just took out some of the loopholes that had been put into the system between 1994 and 2019, and so they just turned the clock back. To a sort of prior period when landlords were not allowed to take huge bonuses at vacancy. So with that background, it's important to understand that a lot of people didn't assume that those laws would sort of revert to their original form. They assumed that they were going to be able to get these vacancy bonuses forever, and they purchased buildings with that assumption in mind. The reality is that nobody is guaranteeing that the laws are not going to change for any small business, for any business. The laws did change, and they changed in a way to protect the public good. They protect the renters, 70% of the city rents. And so I think that is important to remember, is that...
the goal was to protect the public good. Is that the way it's played out, though? I mean, because nobody wants the situation that we're in now, right? The company's bankrupt. They and their investors have taken a bath. They're not happy about that. We interviewed some of the tenants. They're not happy about the situation at all. Yeah,
I think it's important to remember that the buildings were not in good condition before 2019. Pinnacle has a long history of harassing renters to get them out of their homes. There was a filing and a judgment against them for tenant harassment in 2011, for example. And so this business practice of over-leveraging buildings, turning over who lives in them in order to raise the rent is not a sustainable business practice when you consider the affordability crisis that our city is facing. When we told them that they couldn't do that anymore through legislation in Albany, they stopped making repairs in the building. And so I think that is that's not a tenable situation for New Yorkers, and we are hoping to intervene in order to both protect the laws and protect the renters and the housing quality.
As far as you know, is some successor group of investors willing to step in and take the buildings under these circumstances? Because they still have to make the repairs. They still have the cap or the limits on what they can charge in the way of rent. They still have the same sort of spreadsheet problem that their predecessor had.
I think one of the things that we are hoping to be able to figure, there's plenty of responsible landlords in the city of New York, and I think we're hoping to be able to ensure that we're hoping that this portfolio, using this intervention in the bankruptcy proceeding that we filed last night, we're hoping to be able to ensure that the buildings do go to a responsible owner who purchases them at a sustainable price, where the debt service, the need for investment is sustainable given the rent levels in the building.
If nobody does, what happens?
I'm confident that somebody will.
What kind of staff and powers will your office have? I'm trying to sort of figure out what you do on a daily basis and how much we're going to be seeing you in the headlines.
This is something that we're still figuring out. The whole administration is staffing up right now. And the first thing that we did were the announcement of these two initiatives. And now we're figuring out how we're going to get them done. But I'm confident that we can do it.
Okay. So look, generally speaking, the housing conundrum of the city, the ongoing crisis, is that average rents are just far higher than the average household income. That's kind of where the whole thing starts. What, in your opinion, can or should city government be doing about that?
Yeah, I think, in my opinion, we need to be doing really two things that tackle the housing crisis. First is we need to regulate the price of rents. In a city that has a tremendously low vacancy rate that ours does, we need simple common sense regulations like our rent stabilization system that ensure rents are predictable for tenants, and tenants have things like the right to renew their lease and stability, some of the same things that homeownership gives us. We've talked about that before. At the same time, we need to also build more housing, and I really think that those things go hand in hand. At the same time as we announced through executive order, the Mayor's Office to Protect Tenants. We also announced 2 other initiatives to accelerate the production of affordable housing and accelerate getting New Yorkers into housing faster. And so I think that these 3 things taken together really indicate that we want to tackle like sort of both sides of the coin, the things that ensure strong housing quality and, regular controlled rents.
Yeah.
And new production of new housing.
My understanding is that there are thousands of what are called zombie buildings, meaning most or all of the units in those buildings are stabilized, meaning there's an upper cap on how much revenue is going to be brought in through rents, and there's a lot of a backlog of capital repairs that are needed that will never be matched by the rent roll. What do we do in cases like that?
I think we're trying to understand the scope of that issue right now. The numbers on it vary wildly, and we think, it's important to not set policy based on the outlier cases. And we don't have a current sense of how many, truly distressed vacant buildings there are in the city. For the buildings that really are, the city does have a suite of programs that are available to owners who are willing to invest capital in the buildings in order to maintain and upgrade them, whether it's a low-cost loan program, access to capital, access to sort of subsidy, access to rental assistance, which will in turn become like an operating subsidy to the building. Those things are available. We want to make access to those things easier. We're not in it to, punish landlords. We are in it to make sure that rent is stable, predictable, affordable, and housing is high quality in the city of New York. And if, like you said in your question, incomes are low and rents are high, we have to be able to both slow the pace of rent growth and build new housing at the same time in order to tackle this problem.
Do you agree with me that another rent freeze, which is a central promise of the administration, another rent freeze on stabilized units is sort of like giving painkillers to a patient with a broken leg, meaning it's not a bad idea, but it's not going to fix the underlying problem?
I think a rent freeze on its own is not it is really important, and we are committed to matching the rent freeze with a suite of complementary policies that both improve the housing quality, that control cost increases for landlords, which also need to be addressed, whether that's property tax reform, insurance reform, and then again, like making it easier for New Yorkers to get into the affordable housing that we are being built. All of those things need to happen, and we're excited to get to work on them right now. It's been 5 days so far.
Now, is it mostly an article of faith that that you can square that circle, that you can bring down insurance, property tax, and other expenses to a level where landlords can both make a small profit and charge a reasonable rent? Some of these things are legislative agenda items that we are going to have to look hard at with people both in the city council, but also in the state legislature and the governor. And really, we have to have a collaborative approach to solving the property tax problem. But I think there's widespread acknowledgement that it is an issue. And so I think, if we work hard, we can get it done. The same is true for insurance. There's been some creative ideas in that insurance arena recently, and we are getting started, and we're excited to look at them and see what we can do. In your protection of tenants, will that include housing authority tenants?
I think that's one of the questions that we're trying to answer right now. Right now, the 2 initiatives that we have rolled out have really focused on private market renters who are being sort of gouged with additional non-rent fees, with conditions, and then potentially displacement. But it's day 6. We have more to do.
Okay. Let's talk about the tweets.
Okay.
You're in the newspapers, and we'll just go through it nice and slow.
Okay.
It says, from what I understand, is that there were tweets, and I'm saying that advisedly because this is years ago when it was called Twitter, not X.
Yeah.
And you made a number of different statements. I'll ask you about those in a minute.
Okay.
But what was first reported was that you deleted the account. Mm-hmm. Why?
Twitter is Twitter. It's not a particularly friendly place to be. And since it was purchased by, Elon Musk, it has gotten less and less friendly, I will say. And there's a lot of abuse that happens on this website. So I was not enjoying being on it.
There's always Blue Sky, by the way. I like Threads. There's other places.
Well, it's also kind of a distraction, so it's sort of nice to be off the social media.
Well, this is true. Public employees should be working for the public 100% of the time.
Yeah.
What got everyone's attention, of course, is that because none of this ever really vanishes, is they found statements from you saying in a number of places that essentially home ownership of any kind upholds white supremacy. Mm-hmm. The suggestion, of course, is that we should be in some sort of transition away from those kind of arrangements, which suggests that you're not that thrilled about private property as a whole. So I wanted to sort of find out where you're coming from.
Yeah, thank you. I think that those are certainly inelegant and not statements that I would phrase in that way today. Certainly not. I think that I certainly do not think that homeowners are all homeownership is white supremacy. I think what I was speaking of, and again, these are old tweets, is that there are real inequities in the property market, and there's real inequities in the homeownership market in particular. And there has been a long history of exclusion and generational wealth that is afforded to some people and excluded to other people. And, I don't think I phrased that very well 5 years ago, but I think there are real inequities in the private property market that need to be uncovered. Mm-hmm. And in some ways, homeownership, in my view, works for some people. It doesn't work for everyone and shouldn't be the only way that people are able to afford retirement. And when we have home ownership, but we don't have a more robust social safety net in other ways, that means that it is only the people who are able to make that first leap are the people who are able to retire comfortably. And so, that is my view. Mm-hmm. And I don't think I phrased it all that
you'll be asked about it. You'll have an endless number of chances to rephrase it if that's what you want to do. Do you think ultimately that the way we should be allocating housing, which is, of course, vitally necessary for everybody, do you think the right way to allocate it is through some mechanism other than the private market?
I think the private market on its own has not produced housing that is affordable to, a minimum wage worker or people who are even, working class people. And the property market does need to be regulated. And in many ways, it is regulated. For instance, we regulate the cost of debt for middle class homeowners. We've done that for, over 100 years. And so I think the reality is that the line between public and private in the United States is extraordinarily blurry, and we need to find ways. It is government's role to find ways to ensure that people have a safe and affordable place to live.
Let me go back to rent regulation and ask you about it. If you know about it, great. If you don't, I'll give you my best summary of it, which is that in St. Paul, Minnesota, they sort of strengthened their rent stabilization, or their version of what we call rent stabilization, several years ago, and then ended up dialing some of it back because housing production sort of fell off a cliff. Mm-hmm. And it's a very progressive city council. It's all women. They're mostly younger. They have goals and aims and speak in a language that I think would be familiar to a lot of New York activists. Mm-hmm. And they decided they kind of had to dial some of it back. And if I have any of that wrong, tell me. But what's your sense of how much flexibility there is to sort of match the facts on the grounds with the strategies that you want to try and implement?
I think one of the things so rent stabilization in New York City does not cover newly built homes unless there's some other regulatory agreement going on. So in general, that is a major difference between what happened in Minnesota and what happens in New York, is that our rent stabilization system covers buildings that are, in many cases, over 50 years old, mostly over 50 years old. So I think it's important to keep that comparison in mind when we are talking about what happened in St. Paul, Minnesota. Minneapolis, St. Paul. The other thing that I think is that markets take time to correct. So often markets will move slower than a policy intervention. So you do a policy intervention, there often is, something of a pause while the capital markets, the builders, and so on adjust to the new reality. And so, that's a common thing as like sort of land values and so on adjust. So those are sort of two separate thoughts. But
I mean, the challenge or the problem, of course, is that markets will correct in their time, but you're in an administration that has a clock ticking, and you've got 48 months to do whatever you're going to do before the voters are going to weigh in on whether it's successful, right?
Yeah, and I'm confident that, New York has had rent stabilization for, over 100 years. I do think that rent stabilization is an appropriate policy for our city and has been successful at keeping people in their homes at a time when prices are skyrocketing. That doesn't mean that we don't need to invest in buildings that, again, are in many cases over 50 years old, and it doesn't mean that I believe that we can do so without compromising on our affordability agenda.
I asked this question, understanding that I'm not suggesting in any way that any policy will change, but I don't know if you've ever seen this op-ed by Paul Krugman, the Nobel Prize-winning economist at Princeton, who says that, rent stabilization is economics 101. It never works. It always leads to a glut of housing that people can't afford. It always leads to underinvestment and then therefore deterioration. It always leads to people playing games to try and game the system. And that, almost any junior economist knows that. But politically, it's almost impossible to even have that conversation in places. He was writing about San Francisco. I think the same thing would apply to New York City. Well,
I actually think that economic evidence on rent stabilization is changing pretty rapidly. So there have been some new studies recently that show that rent stabilization is effective at stabilizing people's homes, at, ensuring predictable rent increases that are appropriate when you pair it with other policies, such as producing more housing, which I think is important to do. And rent stabilization can help create the political conditions to build more housing as well. Economists also used to talk about how the minimum wage was completely inappropriate and would skew labor markets, and we do it because it's important to achieve sort of other social goals of making sure that people can afford the necessities of life. And so, I am familiar with that. I don't know if I've read that exact op-ed, but I'm familiar with the argument that Krugman is making, and I do believe that the economic understandings of rent stabilization are rapidly changing, and that's why many places are passing rent stabilization laws into effect right now.
So you have your work cut out for you. There's going to be this task force to look into all of the different kind of fees or bureaucratic obstacles that get in the way of more housing production. That's going to be super important. You're going to be looking at how to help tenants in the first place, not just in the Pinnacle Group, but in other kinds of, analogous situations, and figure out how and when the city can intervene. When we talk again in a year or two, or let's give you four, what's going to be different?
I really hope that it is easier for New Yorkers to get repairs when they need them. And I hope that that New Yorkers get a faster response time, both from their landlords, but also from the city when there is a leak in the apartment. I hope that we can do some more proactive intervention. There should never, the Pinnacle situation should not be the situation that we're in. A building should not get so bad and to the point of bankruptcy before the city is ready to intervene. So I'm hoping that we can get really creative with some of our housing programs, in order to, have a more fair and sustainable housing market.
As you may have heard, there are a fair number of units that are actually owned by the city in the form of New York City Housing Authority, where they are racking up violations. They're under the RAD program. They've brought in outside investors or outside managers to try and help take care of some of the stock. And the city news organization recorded something like 14,000 different violations. And some of them are really quite serious in a lot of different places. So, the city is not just an advocate for tenants, but it's also one of the biggest landlords in the country, right?
Yeah, that's right. And I think that over the last few years, NYCHA has worked pretty hard to improve living conditions in NYCHA buildings, and some of the things that they have done through the Preservation Trust program, which is just getting started, and the RAD Pact program that actually are bringing in an investment into the portfolio have been successful while retaining city asset management. And so those are important programs that are improving quality of life for residents, and we're going to need to everything is on the table when it comes to NYCHA. The buildings are in disrepair and really need help.
One of your colleagues, who I believe is the new HPD commissioner, my understanding is she worked on some prefab housing in upstate New York, where you can, if you know what you're doing, you build it in a factory. You streamline every piece of it, you standardize it, you get it in the ground, and it's like $200,000 for a house, which seemed to me quite promising if you can figure out how to do it vertically in New York City.
Yeah, I think controlling the cost of construction, controlling the costs of insurance, controlling the costs of all the operating expenses that owners face, along with controlling the costs of rent should all be on the table. You have a lot of experience. I'm going to let you go at this point, but you have a lot of experience dealing with the legislature in Albany, which in a good session is something of a zoo, right? You're going to be, if anything, in a probably hotter spotlight here in the city because it's the media capital, and there's going to be all kinds of stuff said to try and score political points that have nothing to do with your portfolio. Are you ready for that? I hope so. New York real estate is one of the most controversial things out there. And so I've had a lot of practice, and I hope that we can get it done. I
mean, the former mayor, Eric Adams, apparently put out some kind of a public message calling you, quote, out of your effing mind, which is,
Yes.
Won't be the last time that happens.
It will not be the last time somebody says that about me. But, I'm going to try to stay laser focused on, improving housing quality and supporting New Yorkers who are renting and struggling to stay in the city.
Okay. You work at City Hall and he doesn't. So, there's that, right? Well, listen, best of luck. Stay in touch.
Thank you.
Take care. If you want to keep up with what's happening in New York politics and hear more conversations with the people shaping the future of New York and beyond, subscribe to our channel. And let Spectrum News be your resource for balanced, in-depth political coverage, elections, and issues that matter to you.